In the frozen silence of the northern wilderness, a predator's desperation can shatter even the oldest rules of survival. When a 70-year-old hermit opens his door to find a ghost of the forest waiting on his porch, he must decide if he will follow the laws of nature or the whispers of his own heart. The winter of 2026 had descended upon the northern mountains with a ferocity that few men could endure. For Benjamin, a 70-year-old former forester who had spent the last 2 decades in a remote hand-hewn cabin, the harshness was simply a part of his quiet routine of survival. But on this particular morning, the world outside was a canvas of blinding white and biting frost. Benjamin sat at his heavy wooden table, the dim glow of a lantern illuminating old, crinkled maps that traced the veins of the forest he had once protected. The silence was absolute, or so it seemed, until a sound cut through the howl of the wind. A faint, labored breathing that didn't belong to the elements. It was the sound of distress. Leaning heavily on his cane, Benjamin made his way to the heavy oak door. As he pulled it open, squinting against the sharp, needle-like wind, he saw something that defied everything he knew about the wild. Emerging from the swirling morning mist was a magnificent wild lynx. Her thick silver-gray fur was dusted with snow, and the distinctive black tufts on her ears quivered in the cold. But the powerful predator didn't crouch or growl. Instead, she moved with a slow, heart-wrenching desperation. In her powerful jaws she carried a limp cub. The mother stopped just inches from the porch, her amber eyes locking onto Benjamin's with a piercing, silent plea. She gently laid the tiny, fragile body onto the snow. The cub didn't move. It looked frozen to the core, its breathing so shallow it was nearly invisible. Benjamin knew the hermit's golden rule. Never interfere with the cycle of predators. Yet, as the mother nudged her child and looked back at him, he saw a mother overcoming her primal fear of humans to save her only child. When the tiny creature let out a barely audible, pathetic squeak, Benjamin's instincts as a guardian of the woods kicked in. "I won't hurt him," he whispered into the wind, stepping off the porch. The mother lynx tensed, her ears pinning back, but she did not retreat. She watched with a supreme, agonizing trust as Benjamin scooped up the stiff, freezing body. Once inside, the cabin's warmth felt like a sanctuary. Benjamin worked with the precision of a man who had seen 1,000 winters. He wrapped the kitten in thick, dry towels and fashioned a splint for its twisted rear leg using bits of kindling. He surrounded the cub with bottles of warm water and desperately tried to drip sugar water into its mouth, praying for a sign of life. "Come on, little one," he murmured, massaging the tiny limbs to restore circulation. "Your mom is waiting." Outside, through the frosted windowpane, he could see the mother's silhouette. She hadn't left. She was burying herself in the snow at the edge of the forest, a silent, furry sentinel waiting for a miracle. Part 2: The Silent Pact. The hours that followed were a blur of flickering lantern light and the rhythmic, rasping breath of the tiny creature on the table. Benjamin, who had lived alone in the northern mountains for nearly 20 years, felt the weight of his solitude shift into a heavy responsibility. He sat in his worn wooden chair, nursing a cup of tea that had long gone cold, and watched the bundle of towels. Every time the towels grew damp from the melting frost, he replaced them with fresh, warm ones from the stove. Through the frosted window, the mother lynx remained a haunting silhouette at the edge of the forest, burying herself in the snow to endure the plummeting temperatures. It wasn't until the sun reached its zenith at noon that the first sign of a miracle occurred. The cub's breathing, once shallow and erratic, finally evened out. Slowly, it opened its cloudy, unfocused eyes. When Benjamin reached out a weathered hand, the kitten didn't hiss or recoil. Instead, it briefly pressed its small, now warm head against his palm before drifting back into a deep, healing sleep. A lump formed in Benjamin's throat. He realized he was breaking every rule of the wild, perhaps even inviting danger into his home, but the connection felt undeniable. As evening fell, the mountain's true fury arrived. A massive storm began to rage, and the temperature dropped to a dangerous low. Inside the cabin, the air was warm, but a soft, rhythmic scratching at the door made Benjamin freeze. It wasn't the frantic clawing of a predator, but something quiet and deliberate. He looked through the window and saw her. The mother lynx was pressed against the porch, her nose twitching as she caught the scent of her child inside. With a trembling hand, Benjamin unlatched the heavy door. The wind rushed in, instantly extinguishing his candle and plunging the room into shadows. The lynx did not growl. She stepped over the threshold with a silent, regal grace and moved straight toward the table. Benjamin backed away, pressing himself against the wall to give her space. He watched in awe as the mother wrapped her powerful fur-clad body around the cub and began to lick him, her loud purring vibrating through the small room. The kitten reacted instantly, burrowing deep into her thick fur for comfort. For the next 2 days, a strange and sacred truce held within the cabin walls. While the storm howled outside, Benjamin moved quietly in the shadows. He placed bowls of water and scraps of meat near the table. The mother accepted the offering, watching him with amber eyes that seemed to hold a profound ancient intelligence. There was no fear, only a mutual pact between man and beast. On the third morning, the sky finally cleared, revealing a world transformed by fresh snow. The cub was now warm, active, and standing on its own, its legs stabilized by Benjamin's splint. It was time for the forest to reclaim its own. The seasons in the northern mountains do not merely change. They transform the world with a heavy, uncompromising hand. After the strange truce in the cabin, winter eventually surrendered to a muddy spring, which blossomed into a fleeting, vibrant summer. Throughout those months, Benjamin resumed his life as a guardian of the woods. He hiked the familiar trails, tending to the ancient trees and keeping a watchful eye on the local wildlife. Often, during his long walks, he would find large tufted tracks in the soft earth or see a flash of silver-gray fur vanishing into the thicket. He felt he was being watched, not by a predator seeking a meal, but by a presence that knew him. "Hope you're doing well," he would often murmur to the whispering pines, knowing his words reached ears hidden in the brush. Then late one evening in November, the mountain reclaimed its icy throne. Benjamin had ventured further than usual, driven by a need to check a remote section of the forest before the heavy snows made it impassable. The day was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that precedes a great shift in the atmosphere. As he reached a steep, rocky slope, the weather turned with a sudden, violent malice. An icy wind struck his face like a physical blow, blinding him with a sudden swirl of stinging snow. He tried to turn back, but his boots, normally reliable, slipped on a patch of wet, frozen roots. Benjamin lost his balance. He tumbled down the ravine, hitting trees and jagged rocks that tore at his clothes and bruised his skin. When he finally came to a stop at the bottom, a white-hot explosion of pain radiated from his leg. He tried to push himself up, but his leg buckled with a sickening crunch. It was broken. Dragging himself toward the shelter of a large spruce, Benjamin left a dark trail in the deepening snow. Every movement was an exercise in agony. He reached into his pockets, but his hand came up empty. His phone had been lost in the fall. There was no signal in this deep cut of the mountain anyway. No one knew he was out this far. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted, and the air became a lethal frost. He realized with a terrifying clarity that he could freeze to death before the morning light. Hypothermia is a deceptive killer. It starts with shivering, then moves to a strange, distant numbness. Benjamin tried to stay awake, fighting the heavy fog settling over his mind, but the cold was seeping into his very bones. The pain in his leg became a dull, far-off hum. He felt himself drifting, accepting the encroaching darkness. He closed his eyes, prepared for the end. That was when he felt it, the soft, rhythmic crunch of snow, confident in close. He forced his eyes open, expecting to see a nightmare. Instead, a massive shape emerged from the shadows of the ravine. It was her. The mother lynx stood over him, her amber eyes gleaming with a light that seemed almost human. Behind her, a second shape appeared, a young, powerful male. The cub he had saved months ago was now a grown hunter of the forest. The mother approached cautiously. She sniffed his broken leg and looked directly into his fading eyes. Then she did the incredible. She laid her large, warm body directly across Benjamin's legs, providing a furnace of heat where the circulation was failing. The young male followed her lead, curling his thick fur against Benjamin's chest. Their massive, dense fur became a living, breathing blanket. The mother licked his cheek, the rough texture of her tongue forcing him to stay conscious, refusing to let him slip away. They stayed with him throughout the long, brutal night. Their deep, resonant purring vibrated against him, a soothing rhythm that kept his heart beating. They were his guardians, protecting him from the cold and the dark. As the first gray light of dawn touched the tops of the trees, the lynxes stood up. They didn't run. Instead they moved toward the trail above and began to let out loud, piercing calls, sounds that lynxes rarely make. It was a signal. Minutes later, the faint beam of a flashlight swept across the slope. "Over here. I hear something," a voice called out. Two forest rangers who had noticed Benjamin's light hadn't been turned on at the cabin pushed through the snow. "We wouldn't have found you down here so quickly if not for those strange sounds," one ranger shouted as they descended into the ravine. As the rescuers approached, the two wild cats took one last lingering look at Benjamin and silently dissolved into the forest like ghosts. "Were those lynxes?" the ranger wondered aloud, wrapping Benjamin in a thermal blanket. He checked Benjamin's temperature and paused in disbelief. "You're warm. It's a miracle. It's like someone kept you warm all night." Benjamin looked toward the tree line, tears freezing on his cheeks, knowing exactly who had saved his life. Weeks later, Benjamin sat at his table by the window, his leg in a sturdy cast. He told no one the full details of that night. He knew no one would believe that the wild could show such gratitude. But he knew it was a debt repaid. A life for a life. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, he looked up and froze. At the edge of the woods stood the mother lynx and her son. They looked at his window, their gaze filled with an unspoken understanding. Benjamin slowly stood up, leaning on the table for support. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. The mother's stubby tail gave a single knowing twitch, and then she vanished into the woods, her son following close behind. Benjamin stood by the window for a long time watching the empty snow. The circle was complete, a winter miracle in the heart of the frozen wasteland.